We're going to start off by looking back a year ago and looking at 2020 PHIPA compliance rates. There's a success story to be told there. Then we'll move on to PHIPA access and correction statistics requirements. We'll briefly delve into some administrative aspects of the statistical report, login information, and setting up a new account. Then we'll get into the heart of the presentation in terms of the statistics questionnaire itself and provide a section-by-section overview. Then we'll leave with some tips and takeaways and some IPC resources and how to contact us. Okay. Before we begin, I actually wanted to share this quote from Commissioner Cosine, taken from last year's annual report. It holds true today with the ongoing pandemic and the challenges it's created for everyone. We wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for continuing to champion and uphold access and privacy rights in times of uncertainty. So we're committed to working with you, our stakeholders, in upholding these rights during these challenging times, now and in the future, and whatever the new normal is. So on that note, before we move forward, let's take a look back at a success story from last year's annual report, specifically about 2020 PHIPA compliance rates. In 2020, compliance rates in the healthcare sector was an impressive 96%. It's an especially impressive striking accomplishment given the overall pressures on the healthcare sector due to the pandemic, not to mention the fact that there was a 25% increase in the number of access and correction requests for personal health information. And despite that, there was a 96% compliance rate. So you set the bar very high, and we wanted to congratulate you for that. It's something about which you should all be proud, and like I said, we can all celebrate this achievement. On that positive note, let's turn to PHIPA access and correction statistics requirements. There's a few items here that I think are worth mentioning. Only health information custodians that are PHIPA or MPHIPA institutions must submit a PHIPA access and correction statistics report. Custodians in private practice are not required to submit a PHIPA access and correction statistical report. Okay? If you've ever wondered why this report is required, it's set by the law, and specifically the requirements for statistical reporting with respect to PHIPA are set out under Section 34 of PHIPA and Section 26 of its municipal counterpart, MPHIPA. Another item that I want to cover here is let's look at the type of statistics captured in this report. All written requests under Section 53 and Section 55 of PHIPA must be reported to the IPC, including those that have been withdrawn or abandoned by the individual. So let's look at this very quickly. Section 53 speaks to a patient's statutory right to request access to their personal health information. When they exercise this right in writing, when they submit a written request, please include these types of access requests in your report. And likewise, under Section 55, another statutory right that patients or individuals have is the right to request a correction of their personal health information. And so when they make this type of request in writing, also included in the statistical report, even if it's been withdrawn or abandoned. And we'll delve into that a little bit further in the presentation. Another requirement is to count only written access and correction requests that were made by the individuals, vis-a-vis the patient, or their substitute decision makers for their own personal health information. Now, we do often get questions about substitute decision makers. Please take a look, and many of you may already know this, but just to reinforce and reiterate, Section 26 of the Personal Health Information Protection Act has a ranking list in order of priority of substitute decision makers. Now, they act as though they're in the patient's shoes, so to speak, and can exercise the same rights, the same access and correction rights that the patient can. So they do so on the patient's behalf. One example of a substitute decision maker is a power of attorney, or even a lawyer, if now this is the big if the lawyer is acting on behalf of the patient in making an access and correction request. So we do often get questions about should we include access requests that were made on behalf of the patient by a substitute decision maker, anyone on that list under 26, or even a lawyer. And the answer is, context-wise, if they're making the request specifically on behalf of the patient as it relates to access and correction, then please do include it if it, of course, is a written access request. Another requirement that I want to bring to your attention, and it's certainly a question that we often get year in, year out during statistical reporting season, is for statistical reporting purposes, do not count third-party disclosure requests for personal health information. So if a third party such as, let's say, the WSIB or an insurance company make a request for personal health information for their own purposes, let's say they're conducting an investigation or it's for processing a claim, this would be considered a disclosure request, not an access request. So there's an important distinction made between the two. A disclosure request is to a third party for other purposes. It's not on behalf of the patient, and they should be excluded altogether from the statistical report. We're focusing only on written access and correction requests that are made by the patient or their substitute decision maker. Okay. So with that, we'll briefly look at some administrative aspects of the statistical report, primarily, like I said, login information and how to set up an account. This is the statistics homepage, statistics.ipc.on.ca. So when you land on our homepage, this is what you're going to see. If you have your login ID, you're set. Your login ID and your password, you're set. You can log on and complete your report. If, however, you've forgotten your password, and this sometimes happens, especially if there's a successor who's taken over from a predecessor and somehow the information gets lost in transition, I want to draw your attention to the bottom left-hand corner of this landing page. You can click on Forgot Password, okay, if you want to retrieve or reset your password. And this will take you to this webpage, Login ID and Password Recovery. Now remember, another tip for you to remember is your login ID is always your institution number. That never changes. And as long as the system has the correct primary email address for your health information custodian, then you can input that, click on Recover, and what will happen is the primary email address on file will get an email, an automatic email, in which there will be instructions on how to reset the password. Another aspect that I want to touch on here is setting up a new account. If you need to set up a new health information custodian account within your PHIPA or MPHIPA institution, click on, again, the bottom left-hand corner of our landing page, just below the Forgot Password link, is Please Register Here. It's a link for that. This is going to take you to a page where you will be asked to include this information that you see here. Okay. Things like the name of your organization, the name of your email, the name and email address of the head of the organization, the name, mailing address, email address, and telephone number of the person primarily responsible for completing the report. That's the primary contact that we just touched on, who'd be listed and who'd be in charge of resetting passwords, and your language preference. Okay. Now, the registration page, what I do want to draw your attention to is this section of the registration page and this portion of it for new accounts. You're going to be asked to check off reports, the type of reports that apply to you. As you can see, I've outlined that in a red text box here. There's 5 reports, 5 statistical reports in total. Because you're a health information custodian and an MPHIPA or PHIPA institution, at minimum, you need to check off the MPHIPA or PHIPA report that applies, the PHIPA breach report, and the PHIPA access and correction report. Some of you may also be service providers under Part 10 of the CYFSA. Some custodians are also service providers in that context. So in which case you would also check off the CYFSA statistical report. Now, we have upcoming webinars on both the MPHIPA PHIPA report and the CYFSA report, and we'll touch on that more on that later in this presentation. Now, moving on to the actual statistics questionnaire. Okay, so we're about to now delve into and look at the sections that make up the PHIPA Access and Correction Statistics report. The first section, as we can see here, is the contact information or the identification of your institution. This is where you're going to input, confirm, and update the contact information for the custodian. And again, this includes, again, you've probably seen a theme here, or a pattern, the primary contact name of the person who will be completing the report on behalf of the custodian and their email address, among other contact information. In this section, there's a drop-down. So section 1.2, there's a drop-down list of institutions. So in addition to being a custodian, please select the type of MPHIPA or PHIPA institution you identify as in this section. And for the purposes of this presentation, I just arbitrarily clicked on Health Board, okay? Local Boards of Health. This is followed up by the type of health information custodian. So in this section 1.3, you're going to check off the box that applies to you. And this section, if it looks familiar to you, it's because it mirrors to a very large extent section 3 of the personal health information, which provides an expansive list of health information custodians. So this slide here, section 2. For section 2.1, we get a lot of questions about section 2.1 in the following context. What we're looking for in this section is the number of uses or purposes for which personal health information was disclosed that was inconsistent with your written public statement under section 16 of PHIPA. So section 16 requires that custodians have a written public statement about their information practices. And here's a tip about this section. It does not relate to breaches. Sometimes custodians will mistake that this section is asking for the number of breaches in the context of inconsistent use. And as we know, there's a separate standalone breach statistics report. So this section has nothing to do with breaches. But this section simply, in order for you to look at this section and complete it accordingly, like I said earlier, look at section 16 and your written public statement. And if you have not used personal health information outside of or inconsistent with the written public statement, then input 0 here. In fact, the majority of submissions that we get have 0 in this section. Some more context, I'll give you an example, okay? In other words, okay, how do you know it's an inconsistent use as it relates to your written public statement? A good example or a common example is an inconsistent use would be if a custodian uses personal health information for the purpose of research, for the purposes of research, and that use or that purpose was not set out in the written public statement under section 16. If something like that occurs, then you would put the number of times that occurred in this box. Now, I also want to draw your attention to the boxes below. I've highlighted in a red text box there. I like to think of these boxes as a fork in a road, if you will, in terms of how the rest of your report will unfold. Please ensure that you've checked off the right box. This is very important. If you received and completed 0 access correction requests, check off the first box, and then you can proceed to the final section there. If you received and completed 1 or more access requests during the year, or carried some from the previous year, check off the middle box and proceed to the next section of the report, which is section 3. Now, if you only received and completed correction requests, check off the third box and proceed to section 9, where you can input your correction statistics. If you accidentally select box 1, 0 request on both fronts, access and correction, and then proceed with inputting your stats under each section, when it comes time to submit your report at the end, you will, in all likelihood, definitely receive an error message because there is a disconnect with the option you chose here. So please be mindful of this section and ensure that you're checking off the right box. For the purposes of this presentation, I selected the second option, received and completed 1 or more access requests during the year. So that brings us to the next section, Section 3. Section 3 focuses on the number of written access requests that you received during the reporting year. And remember, reporting year for statistical reporting purposes is January 1st through December 31st of the previous calendar year, right? So some tips to consider in this section. Like I said earlier, count only the number of written access requests made by individuals or their substitute decision makers for access to their own personal health information that you received. Okay, so Section 3.1 is all about the number of requests received in writing. If you receive, this is another tip, if you received a request that requires clarification, let's say you get a request from a patient or the SDM and you're not exactly sure what they're asking, you need clarification, do not count this as a request received until the requester provides you with all the information you need to complete the report. Okay, so if you need clarification, that's the way to go about doing it. And also another tip, do not include correction request in this section. That comes later in the report in Section 9, otherwise you'll be double counting. So this is only access requests, okay? Moving on to Section 4, just below, time to completion. In this section, we're focusing on the number of completed access requests for personal health information. Now, another tip, how do you know when a request is completed? It's completed when you issue a decision letter. The moment you issue a decision letter, it's, for all intents and purposes, from your side of things, from your perspective, it's a completed request. So Section 4 is broken down by the response time or time to completion for all access requests. Okay, just some background information here. Under PHIPA, custodians must respond to access requests no later than 30 days after receiving the request. But PHIPA also permits custodians to extend the time limit by an additional 30 calendar days. If, for example, they need more time for consultation, necessary to reply to the request, or if meeting the time limit would unreasonably interfere with the operations of the custodian, they are permitted to extend the time limit by an additional 30 days. However, if an extension of time is a notice is given, a health information custodian has to inform the patient or the individual of this extension. They have to give the individual a written notice of the extension, setting out the length of the extension, vis-a-vis the 30 additional days, and the reason for the extension. So this section, that's what this section is capturing. How many requests did you complete, the number of requests you completed within the statutory 30 days? How many did you complete in over 30 days with an extension notice? And how many did you complete in over 30 days without an extension notice? Therein lies the compliance implication. The total of all this is the amount of the total access requests. This is going to give you the total number of access requests completed. So Section 4 is very important because this total number of completed access requests will be broken down in a number of ways in the next few sections, in the next few upcoming sections. So it's important to keep this in mind in that the subsequent sections need to tie back to Section 4.4. Okay? So we'll give you an example here, Section 5. Section 5 provides a further breakdown of the total number of completed requests, specifically along 3 different sections. Section A and B are used to determine the number of requests completed that are in compliance or not in compliance with the statutory timelines. Okay, so let's take one section at a time. Section A within Section 5, or Part A. How many requests did you complete within 30 days without a notice of extension? And then also add to that, how many requests did you complete beyond 30 days without a notice of extension? So Section A is focusing on completed requests where no time extension notice was issued. Okay? Whereas Part B of Section 5, how many requests, now this deals with the notice of extension where it was issued. Okay? So how many requests did you complete within the time limit set in the notice of extension? And how many requests did you complete beyond or it exceeded the time limit set in the notice of extension? When you add sections A and B, the total requests completed should be in line with the total in Section 4, the section that we just went through. So that's what I meant. It has to tie in. Now, Section D, or Part D of Section 5, this is a subset. What we're looking for here is expedited access that should already be included in the total. So some background information about expedited access. Sometimes patients or their SDMs, their substitute decision makers, they request access to personal health information on an expedited or urgent basis. In this scenario, custodian should give the response required within the time period that the individual specifies. If, though, so there are conditions, the individual has to provide the custodian with the evidence that's satisfactory to them that they indeed need this information on an urgent basis within the time period specified, okay? And so the condition is that, along with the custodian is reasonably able to give the required response within that time period. So that's expedited access. So here in line 5.8, you're asked for the total completed request, and of the total completed request, how many were requests for expedited access and completed within the requested time period? That's 5.8. Whereas box 5.9, you're asked of the total completed request, how many were requests for expedited access and were completed in excess, right, of the requested time period, beyond the requested time period. Section 5A. This section provides an opportunity for custodians to explain why the 30-day timeline or statutory time limit to complete requests could not be met. So wherever there's a deviation with respect to compliance, this is where you can explain why that happened. And it also requests details on how you think you can improve on response time in order to be compliant with PHIPA in the future. So if you anticipate any circumstances that will improve your ability to comply with PHIPA, you could put this here, okay? Based on last year's compliance rates, though, what we went through earlier on, the success story of 96% despite the pandemic and despite the increase, 25 or 26% increase in the number of requests, compliance rates last year were excellent, and so you set, like I said, the bar very high. But at any event, you know, we understand the pandemic has added another layer of delays, if you will. So you can use this section to explain any deviations year to year, any issues with respect to time to completion compliance. Okay. Now, in this slide here, this section provides an opportunity. It really delves into what course of action was taken for each of the requests completed along specific categories. Okay, so it's the disposition of requests, what course of action was taken. Now, a few tips for this section. If a request had one or more outcome, enter it in each applicable box. And you don't necessarily need to choose one on only one outcome per request. For example, you may have partially denied access because a provision was applied, and some of the records did not exist. So you can, like I said, you don't necessarily need to choose only one outcome per request. And I also want to draw your attention to a few other boxes in this section. Firstly, 6.8. If you look at 6.8 here, this is what I meant earlier, where you include, if the request is completed, you include it even if the patient or the substitute decision maker abandoned it, withdrew it, or didn't access it ultimately. If you've completed it from your end, then you should count it in this section nonetheless. Okay? Line 6.9, just below it, asks of the requests that were not pursued, in other words, of the requests that were withdrawn or abandoned by the requester in 6.8, how many were following a fee estimate? So you provided them with a fee estimate and then they withdrew or they abandoned it. Line 6.11 here at the bottom box here, that's the total of the boxes 6.2 and 6.5. Okay, I have those boxes in red text. These are the total requests that were denied in whole or part where a provision of PHIPA was applied. So line 6.11 is only going to add those two sections, right, where it was denied in whole or in part because of a provision under PHIPA. And this is a precursor to the upcoming section, mind you, which we're heading off to now. Section 7. It brings us to this section of the report, because in this section it's provisions apply to deny access. Okay. Now, please note that more than one provision may be applied to each request. You may have one or more provisions or grounds on which you denied access. And let me clarify here. What do we mean by provisions? When you receive an access request, the default is to facilitate the request by providing access unless a provision in PHIPA is used to deny access, right? So these provisions are primarily found under sections 51, 52, and 54, subsection 6 of PHIPA. So section 51, they're exclusion clauses. They exclude certain types of records and information from the access provisions of PHIPA. An example would be quality of care information, or raw data from psychological tests. These, if you look at section 51, again, you look at section 51 for the types of records that are excluded from the access provisions. On those grounds, you can deny access. 52 includes limited exceptions where you can deny access. It could be legal client privilege, or in your professional opinion, you believe that if you disclose the information or you grant access to the patient or the SDM, there's a reasonable risk of causing bodily harm, right? So 52 will give you those limited exceptions where you can, in fact, deny access to personal health information. 54 subsection 6, again, is another provision or grounds on which you can deny access. And it's frivolous or vexatious. In other words, if the custodian believes the request was made in bad faith, they can deny the request. Okay? So depending on how many provisions you apply to the request, and there may be more than one, like I mentioned, the total in this section must be greater than or equal to box 6.11 in the previous section. So please keep that in mind as you input your statistics, okay? So again, just to recap here, you can provide more than one provision per request that was denied. And so provisions are applied to deny access. It could be along 51, 52, or 54 subsection 6. Moving on to the next section, fees. In this section, we're looking for the number of access requests where fees were collected, waived, and the respective dollar amounts, okay? A few remarks about fees. Now, you probably all know PHIPA permits custodians to charge what's called a reasonable cost recovery, but it does not prescribe or quantify the amount of fees. So as the oversight agency for PHIPA, the IPC issued Health Order Number 9 some 12 years ago now, which still stands today. It's still in effect today. In this Health Order Number 9, we established recommended fee guidelines for access to personal health information. And these recommended fee guidelines were based on proposed regulations that were never adopted. So if you're ever wondering what you can charge, Health Order Number 9 is the go-to resource. And until or if PHIPA is amended such that prescribed regulations come into force that quantify what a reasonable cost recovery is, then please refer to Health Order Number 9 in the meantime, okay? PHIPA also permits you to waive fees at your discretion. So patients can request a waiver, either in full or in part. And from the custodian's perspective, at their discretion, they can consider such a request. And if they believe it's fair or equitable to do so, they can grant a waiver. So we're also capturing that statistic in this section. Okay. Now, next slide. In the next slide, this is the final section of the report: corrections and statements of disagreement. If an individual believes that their personal health information held by a health information custodian is inaccurate or incomplete with respect to the purpose the health information custodian uses that information, they have a statutory right to request that the health information custodian correct the personal health information, right? So they have a right to make a request to correct. If they do so in writing, that's what we're capturing here. We're also capturing here other statutory rights that they have to exercise. Specifically, they have a right to receive a written notice from the custodian that either grants or refuses the request. So this section is also capturing how many requests were granted in full or in part or refused altogether. Okay. Patients also have a right to request that a written notice of the correction, let's say you grant the request, is shared with anyone that the custodian discloses to. So if you send personal health information to another custodian and you're disclosing it to another custodian, you must also attach a written notice of the correction, with some exceptions. Some of the exceptions will be if it has no effect on the provision of health care or other benefits to the individual. That's one exception. But outside of that limited exception, if you granted a correction request, then there's a statutory obligation to notify other health information custodians of the correction as well. You also have to require the custodian, the patient can require that the custodian attach a statement of disagreement in the context of the correction request being denied. So if you've denied the request, the patient has the right to attach what's called a statement of disagreement that they write in their own words. It's a written, hopefully concise written statement of disagreement in which they outline the grounds on which they disagree with the personal health information in the record, why they believe it's incomplete or inaccurate. And so from the custodian's perspective, once you've denied it, you have to attach that statement of disagreement and disclose that statement of disagreement whenever you disclose the information at issue to another custodian or third party. So all of these components are included in Section 9 in this section. And so it's a pretty straightforward section there and a very short one by comparison there. So that's the last section of the report. So once you end the report at the very end, after Section 9, you're going to see this here. You have an opportunity to review the statistical report and make sure that you submit questionnaire, that you click on this Submit Questionnaire button here. Okay? My suggestion is to submit questionnaire, log off, and exit the browser. Then you can always log back in. You don't have to, by the way, you don't have to complete the report in one sitting. So as you're moving along from one section to another, if you save your work, you can log off. And then once you log on again, the system will take you to the last section where you left off. Okay? You can always log on to also view a printer-friendly version, this button here where my cursor is circulating here. This is the button that you would press. If you ever need a copy of the report for your own records, you can print it out. You can also, by clicking this button, you can also save it as a PDF document for your own records. Okay? So that's, those are the two things that I want to bring to your attention with respect to how to submit the questionnaire. And once you've submitted, you should get the success prompt or notification where it's thanking you for your cooperation, that your questionnaire was submitted successfully, and it also reinforces the deadline, right? March 31st, 2022. That's the deadline. You should also get the primary contact on file should also receive an automatic email notifying them or confirming that they've submitted the report. But again, at any time between submitting the report and the deadline, you can go back into the report and amend it or correct it if you've come across an error or you need to add an extra completed request or change the numbers a bit with new information. By all means, you are able to do that up to and including the deadline date of March 31st, 2022. Okay? So yes, we can't stress this enough. I know we're still in January, the tail end of January, But before you know it, March will be here. So the sooner you get it over with, you can strike this list off your PHIPA responsibilities. Okay? So some takeaways, tips and takeaways, just to summarize here. Again, only health information custodians that are also PHIPA or MPHIPA institutions must submit a PHIPA Access and Correction Statistics report. Custodians in private practice are not required to submit a PHIPA Access and Correction Statistical report. Count only written access and correction requests made by the individual or their substitute decision makers. Okay? Remember, if you want to learn a little bit more about, okay, is this an SDM, a substitute decision maker, please look at the ranking list in order of priority under Section 26 of the law. Include written access and correction requests that have been withdrawn or abandoned. So if you've completed the request on your end, you've issued a decision letter, and the patient or the substitute decision maker subsequently withdraws or abandons and never accesses the information, you still include it for statistical reporting purposes because you've completed it on your end, okay? And don't count third-party disclosure requests in your statistical report. Again, it's a common question we get every year. Third-party disclosures to someone other than the patient or their substitute decision maker for their own purposes. Again, good examples would be the WSIB. They may be conducting an investigation, an insurance company who may be processing a claim. They're reaching out to you for a disclosure request so they can get the information for their own purposes. We're not focused on that for statistical reporting purposes. We're only focusing on written access and correction requests directly from the patient or their substitute decision maker. Keep track of statistics over the course of the calendar year. It will help you, and I'm sure many of you do this already, and you may vouch for this in terms of it will definitely help this time of year. If you tracked your statistics throughout the course of the year, when it comes time to submit your statistics, it's a smooth process by comparison, compared to if you didn't, let's say. But at any event, your login ID is always your institution number, so there's a few tips here for administrative purposes. Yeah, always remember your login ID is your institution number. You can always retrieve and reset passwords by way of the primary email address, so make sure that it's current, up-to-date, and accurate. And that way you can reset the password, get the login ID, which is the institution number, and then log on. Moving on, I wanted to highlight a few resources here that might help you with your statistical report. Okay, the first one is an FAQ. It's a statistics report, an FAQ on the PHIPA and MPHIPA submissions or institutions, but it does have answers to questions that relate to PHIPA and MPHIPA institutions who are also custodians. And we've answered those questions in this presentation as well. But it's worthwhile taking a look at that. It's available on our guidance section of our website, and you can certainly look at that there. The second one there is the PHIPA Access Request Workbook and Completion Guide. It's available under the Guidance for Organizations and under the Guidance section as well. And also, this particular completion guide is very helpful. A tip that I've received from custodians is that some of them have it open as they're completing their statistical report online. So they have it open at the same time. That way, as they're inputting or working on the workbook and inputting it in the statistical website, they can catch any error messages that might come up instead of doing it first in the workbook and then transferring it over. So that might be a helpful tip. And the other one is Health Order Number 9. We talked about it under the fees section. And again, it's the go-to resource when you're thinking about, when you're asking yourself, okay, you have the right to charge a fee, but the question is what to charge. And the recommended fee guidelines are based on this order. It's a 30-page order, so if you don't have time to read the entire order, specifically focus on pages 20 to 25 of this order. Again, this order is available under the Decisions section. When you go into the search engine, you can put the Health Order Number 9, and it will populate. And so pages 20 to 25 are the pages that focus on the recommended fee guidelines. Okay? recommended fee guidelines, and it provides itemized line by line what you can charge. And there's a list, there's a table, and more and more patients are also aware of this order as well. So it speaks to custodians, but patients alike as well. Yeah. On this How to Contacts page, let me just explain. Any general inquiries, info@ipc.on.ca. Okay? Any inquiries specifically related to statistics@ipc.on.ca. Thank you so very much for attending this webinar and for your overwhelming response to this webinar. If you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to call us or email us. You can call us and ask to speak with an information officer. I'm one of them. There's 3 of us. We're more than happy to answer any of your questions. Or email us at statistics@ipc.on.ca. Okay? Well, thank you very much, everyone. I hope everyone has a great day ahead. Take care. Bye-bye.